Perfect.
It's my greatest pleasure to be talking to you, Andre. Today, could you please introduce yourself and what do you do for business?
Thank you very much. Nour, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Hopefully,
Perfect.
yes. So Nour, thank you very much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. Nowadays, I work with mentoring schools. So basically what I do is help implement bilingual programs in private schools here in Brazil. But I also work as an education consultant. So I do a lot of workshops. I lecture quite a lot. I do research about the brain and psychology and things like that. And my dream is to leave my mark on the planet, to change the world through education. Nowadays, I'm working with a big corporation here in Brazil, offering training and pedagogical support. But, I've worked everywhere. I've reviewed books for National Geographic Learning. I worked as an English as a foreign language teacher for 15 years in different schools here in Brazil. And now I'm very much into teacher training. I really like teacher education, and I want to make sure that I spread the knowledge that I've been acquiring so that teachers can make a bigger impact in their practice.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Let's fly to the future. You say you want
Yes.
to leave your footprint, your impact. Let's say
Yes.
you're 100% successful. How would this impact look like?
That's a great question. I feel like we're still teaching in a way that is not very brain friendly. I like to use this expression, brain friendly, because cognitive psychology and neuroscience have made a lot of discoveries over the last maybe 2 or 3 decades, especially with neuroimaging technology. And we now know that there are better practices we can use in the classroom to make students learn more effectively. So we can have a direct impact on their student outcome, on their learning outcomes. And I think my impact is to somehow contribute to that. I want schools to adopt a certain framework or guideline based on how the brain works. So I want teachers and schools to look at the brain sciences and try to basically create lesson plans based on how the brain works, so that we can have a much better outcome in terms of how students learn and what they learn. So I think my dream is to create something that students can use and teachers can use. I have actually done it already, hopefully, as part of my dissertation, and to see schools using that and to see that schools are getting better results because of it. That's the dream.
So in simple words, could you phrase what you would like to change in schools?
Yes, I think the first thing, so principle number 1 would be their mindsets. I think schools are very much content oriented. They're still trying to make students memorize a lot of things. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I want schools to work with projects much more than they are doing right now. We know that PBL, for example, project-based learning, works very well, but we don't see it being used in many schools. So PBL. And I think principle number three, it would be to use brain-friendly techniques or strategies to make sure that everybody learns the best way they can, according to how the brain works. Basically, that's it. Yeah.
Perfect. Could you explain a little more on principle number 3?
Yeah, so principle number 3 is about incorporating the learning sciences into not only the curriculum, what we should teach, but how we should teach, and especially teacher education. So I think a lot of teachers, they are basically replicating things that were passed on to them from the previous generation of teachers and so on, going back to maybe hundreds of years ago. And I feel like we are still teaching in a very teacher-centered way. We're still, the beacon of knowledge at the center of the classroom. So everything comes from the teacher and goes towards the student. And I'd like to think that there is a better way for us to have our students integrate what they know into the curriculum and work on possible solutions to problems we have in the community. So imagine, so my dream is actually imagine if students were working on problems that require a solution, to improve our society as a general, but they were doing that at school, inside their classrooms, and learning from that, because they have to use a bunch of skills to do that. And so they could do simulations, they could work collaboratively, and they could come up with potential solutions for a lot of the problems we have. So that should be the purpose of education, right?
Yeah, right, of course. Okay, let's go deeper, Andre. How do we learn?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. I actually brought my brain here to show you. I have this silicone replica of the right hemisphere. And the brain is a very unique organ, and it learns in a very complex way. But I think I can narrow down into a couple of principles. We understand that this pink part that we call the cortex is where we store a lot of information, because we have the neurons. So neurons are one type of brain cell that I think most people are familiar with. And we have a lot of environmental stimuli that come to us, So we're looking at something, we're listening to something, we're feeling something. Those stimuli are converted into signals that our brain can encode, can actually decipher, let's say decipher, and transform them into electrical signals that travel down the axon of the neurons, and then they form neuronal networks. So learning is about forming networks in the brain, making sure that your neurons are communicating the way they should, right? But it's very difficult to say how this happens and when it happens, because it depends on many variables, right? So you have to have the right state of mind, for example. It's not just about cognition, it's also about emotion. So maybe you have a high IQ and you don't have any problems related to learning, but maybe somebody in your family is sick, or maybe you're not feeling your best that day. All those things influence in how you're going to learn. But we know that there's a very simple formula that can basically narrow down things, and it's learning requires attention and memory. So for you to learn anything, you need to pay attention to it. So it's environmental stimulus. And then you need to be able to retrieve that from your cortex as memory. So you need to be able to access that later and do something with that. But the problem is, how do you get there? So that's why it's a complex question. But one thing I can tell you right now, so we can wrap up this question. If your students are not paying attention, they will not learn. So that's a very simple principle we should go by. Make sure that they're paying attention. Otherwise, their brains are not even absorbing the environmental stimuli. So how can they learn? They won't have a memory of that later. But maybe they were paying attention, they consolidated that memory, they're having trouble retrieving that memory. That's also a possibility. So we need to make sure that we activate their prior knowledge when we're asking questions. So there are many things we can do, but we don't know them because we don't study the learning sciences and the brain sciences, right? That's what I want to do. I want to promote these science. Yeah.
Yeah, that is so, I cannot say inspirational, interesting, and eye-opening.
Yes.
Let's go to another more difficult question somehow.
Yes.
How do we retain information in our minds, in our brains?
So that's a great question, and maybe it's not as difficult as the first one, maybe, because it's a simple formula as well. There is a very famous memory model that was probably elaborated in the 60s, 50s, 60s by Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin. So they call it the multi-store model. Like I said, you need attention, right? So for you to hold anything or retain anything in your brain as memory, first you have to store it in your sensory memory. So it's about your senses, right? So when you look at something, I'm looking at my cell phone, I'm gonna store the stimuli, I'm going to convert it into electrical signals, and it's going to be in my eyes, basically. And then I have to send it to my short-term memory. So that's a very small, let's say, storage compartment that we have in our brains. And it's normally in the center of the brain in a structure known as hippocampus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then for me to be able to save that forever, long term, so that's why we call it long-term memory, I need to do something called consolidation. And that requires me to rehearse that information. So I have to repeat. It depends on whatever I'm learning. I don't know how many times exactly, it depends, right? And then I also have to retrieve it a couple of times so that I make sure that I am accessing that neuronal pathway in my brain, right? So it takes basically 3 steps: sensory memory, short-term memory, and then long-term memory. And right in the middle, sensory memory, it caught my senses, my eyes, my ears. Then I have to give attention to it. So if I add attention to it, then it goes to my short-term memory, right? So that's the formula. The problem is, again, it's very hard for us to say how many times you need to retrieve something, how many times you have to rehearse something. It depends on the type of information, on your state of mind, on many, many things. So it's not really
Yeah, go ahead.
many variables, actually.
Yeah.
So it's hard for us to say there's a formula for it. Yeah.
Let's go to the learner side. What are the types of learners?
Well, there's a lot of controversy when we talk about learners, especially when we refer to them as people with different styles of learning, right? So this is something that we've been replicating for decades, I think. And now neuroscience knows that there isn't really such a thing as a learning style. It's not like that. You cannot really label students as visual learners or kinesthetic learners or auditory learners, because we all learn from all those different modes of input, let's say. But we do have learners who have, maybe it's easier for them to attend to information because their attentional networks work better, because they can self-regulate better. So we also have students who have this visual preference. So they like to, I don't know, sketch something when they're watching a lecture. They want to maybe write down a couple of things, right? So we know that those learners they become more successful when they vary the type of techniques and strategies they use to learn. That's what we know. But yes, we could say that there are students who learn faster. There are students who need more time to get to the same results. And I think that's the wonderful variability of our brains, right? Because you can learn content A faster than me, but I can learn content B faster than you because of my previous experiences and the way I was brought up, because of my genetics. There's so many factors involved there. And what it tells us is that everybody can learn and everybody benefits from learning in multiple ways, right? So if you think you only have auditory learners in your classroom and they only learn from, oral or auditory input, that's actually not very accurate. You should use multiple strategies, because then you're going to strengthen the representations of the information they have in their brains. So you're going to strengthen their neuronal networks, and it's going to be easier for them to find that because, it's stronger in their brains, right? So I think that's a good thing, because we don't have to think of students as, labels, like boxes, tiny boxes that they belong to this group or that group. Everybody belongs to all groups. And we can always find a strategy that works best for different types of knowledge that we're trying to learn, right?
Yeah, that is so interesting. Let's describe the learning environment. What are the main requirements for a successful instructional process?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question too. I think the very first thing we should worry about when we're talking about the environment is if it's welcoming and safe. Because so here, let me show you the brain again. So this is what we call the cortex, and the areas that are below the cortex right in the center of the brain. We call them subcortical structures. So you have the limbic system that has to do with emotional regulation or emotional response, consolidating memory and things like that. And also the FFF response, the fear, the flight, fight, freeze response when we feel intimidated, for example. There is a very small structure called the amygdala in the brain. So if you are in an environment that you feel intimidated, that you feel that you don't belong there, that you feel exposed, you are working on a subcortical level, which means that you cannot even reach your prefrontal cortex very well. And you need your prefrontal cortex to learn because your working memory system is there. So you need to access this part of the brain here. But if you're working on a subcortical level because you're afraid, you're basically in survival mode, you cannot learn, right? So every learning environment needs to be welcoming and safe. And I think we need to make sure it's okay for students to make mistakes, right? Because I was brought up, I remember going to school as a kid. I couldn't make mistakes. Making mistakes was a terrible thing, It made me seem stupid or something like that. So I think we need to change that mindset. That's the very first thing we have to do. And I also think that you need to offer students different study or workstations in the classroom so that they can make multiple representations in their brains of whatever it is you're trying to teach them. So when I go to a lot of schools in Brazil, we're still working with very traditional classrooms, rows of seats, and then, one student sitting behind the other. And then you don't really have room for anything else there. Just listening, looking at the teacher and listening at the teacher. But the hands-on element that we want to see in the classroom is missing. We want the students to stand up and move around and do things manually, use their hands. That's very important for learning. So I think we need to design classrooms in a better way. We can look at Montessori, for example. Montessori had this wonderful philosophy of, furniture as part of the learning process. So we need to do that even for adult learners. And I also think that the way we teach, so we're talking about instructional design and how to teach, the way we teach, the words we use, the methods we choose, they can impose a very heavy load on our students. So we call it cognitive overload. So maybe what I'm trying to teach is not that complex, but the way I teach it makes it complex. And that makes my students' working memory filled with information. So I basically, the capacity is full. I cannot put anything there anymore. And then they don't learn very well. And they need to have the opportunity to revisit things with a certain frequency. We call this spaced repetition. And I think those four things I talked about, if we have them, we can make the learning experience much more effective and much more, pleasant for the students, right?
So basically, you are recommending more and more science and more psychology in the educational practice.
Yes, and I don't think we need to have a degree in psychology like I did. I think we need to understand the basic principles that somehow apply in the classroom. So, but yes, I think every teacher and every teacher trainer and even students, they should have a very basic knowledge of psychology. They should understand things like growth mindset, self-determination, like intrinsic motivation, self-efficacy. They should understand things like neuroplasticity, which is the capacity that our brain has to rewire itself and always learn, right? We are always learning. Right now, you're making different connections in your brain because you are seeing me, we're talking about other things that you may have never talked about. So you are making different connections in your brain. So when we learn that, I think we can be better learners, especially kids who struggle, because they will come to you and say, I know I can't learn, teacher, Mr. Whatever. I know because I've tried. And then I tell them, but did you know that your brain is plastic? And there's a lot of evidence showing, and what is that? Well, basically you can always make different connections. You just have to find a way to make that connection in your brain, and I can help you with that. So if they learn that, suddenly they're more open to the learning experience and trying different things and trying to find what works for them, right?
What I understand is that there is a big lack of coordination and cooperation between teachers on the field and scientific and psychological support.
Yes. Well, this is actually the the topic of my dissertation. So this is perfect because nowadays there is a science that is called mind, brain, and education. So I recommend everyone listening to us to dig a little deeper. Just search the MBE, mind, brain, and education. And what the science does basically is bring together cognitive neuroscience, cognitive, social, developmental psychology, and education, pedagogy, andragogy. That's how we teach adults, and put them together and look at the contributions of all those areas. So it's a transdisciplinary field of knowledge that helps inform teachers, and not only teachers, us students, when we're learning something, how we should learn, how learning takes place. So I'll give you a very silly example. We understand that for us to consolidate the declarative memory, so if I learn a new concept, I need to sleep to consolidate that memory. That's how we consolidate declarative memory, during our sleep. So our hippocampus is replaying the concept that we learn while we're sleeping, right? And then, of course, we have to go back to that concept a couple of times over a certain period so that it's actually really consolidated in the brain. So instead of assigning homework to be done on the same day after class, for example, so normally that's what students do. They leave the classroom, they get home, and maybe at night they'll do their homework or something like that. It's actually better for you to sleep first and then do it the next day, because then you will have consolidated your memory. And if that knowledge is there, that means you are on the right path. Let's say you're consolidating that concept. If you completely forgot that, that's great too, because now you have the chance to do a spaced repetition, one trial. It's one day after you saw it, right? And that's great. If you did it on the same day, right after class, it's still fresh in your memory. So you can still retrieve it probably very easily. So you're not struggling. You're not trying to actually retrieve it from your cortex. It's still in your hippocampus. It hasn't consolidated. You see what I'm saying? So there are things we can do. There are techniques we can use based on brain knowledge. And that's what the MBE science does. Mind, brain, education tries to translate those very complicated principles that we test in the lab inside an fMRI machine, things like that, into easily applicable classroom practices so that we can have an impact on students' learning outcomes.
That's great. So let's go to another area. What is cognitive development?
Yeah, this has a lot to do with what Jean Piaget, I'm sure many educators have heard of this guy. So he was the one who proposed that there is a certain linear progression that we are all going through as we are growing up, since we were born until today. We're going through a certain development, and he actually labels each stage of our cognitive development. But this is one area. If we try to think about neuroscience, cognitive development is basically developing the structures and the functions of your brain so that you can use your cognition. And cognition relates to thinking, reasoning, imagining, for example. So we understand now that it takes about 25, 27 years for you to fully develop your brain. We understand, for example, that your brain starts developing from the back to the front. And so the last part you're going to develop is your prefrontal cortex, which has a lot to do with sophisticated thinking or higher order thinking skills, and also self-regulation. So that's why, and if you think about kids, they have trouble self-regulating. They are very impulsive. So they do things without thinking, with no consequence, right? Because their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, so they don't have time to stop their behavior. That's what we call inhibitory control, that is processed in the prefrontal cortex, right? But if you think about kids developing, as Piaget said, so there are different ages and different things we can do. So the very first thing we can do is about senses, sensory motor stage. So you're basically trying out the world, experimenting, touching things. That's why babies put a lot of things in their mouths. They're trying to make sure that it's not something edible. So maybe they can eat that or not. So they're experimenting with the world, right? And then you have the pre-operational stage, the formal operational. So basically what is happening inside a kid's brain is that certain functions are being assigned to different parts of their brain, to different locations, like language is being assigned to the temporal lobe. Vision is being assigned to the occipital lobe, for example. And then you have motor skills that are going to consolidate in the premotor cortex. And that's cognitive development. It's just becoming a fully functioning human being with all your faculties, all your cognitive skills, imagining, reasoning, thinking, abstract thinking. That is very important. So we don't get to that stage till we are preteens, for example. So kids cannot do abstract thinking. Kids cannot think in terms of hypothetical things, like if I did that, then that would happen. They don't have the ability because their brains are not fully developed yet for them to be able to do that, right?
Does the education or do the education systems currently take that into consideration?
I'd say that yes and no. I believe that if you look at my educational system here in Brazil, and you go to kindergarten, for example, in the United States, they call it K-12 or primary school or whatever, where you have kids. I think a lot of the stuff we do there is based on the Piaget or Piagetian principles, right, of cognitive development, and also Montessori. So she talked a lot about sensitive periods. You have certain ages that you can do things, right? A lot of primary school is based on that, most definitely. But here in Brazil, once you get to, after kindergarten, so you are in elementary school, I think they completely forget about cognitive development, because what they are doing is they're demanding kids to learn a lot of abstract things that they don't have the skills to manipulate in their minds. And they are drowning kids' working memory with too much information. And they're not really using how the brain works. So they're basically, a lot of traditional schools will have all kids sitting in rows, listening to the teacher, copying things, filling in gaps, and doing a list of activities, And we know that kids don't learn that way. Adults can learn that way better because we have more discipline and self-regulation. We have a lot of prior knowledge. We can control ourselves and sit still for I don't know, a couple of hours maybe. Kids, they need to move. They need to touch things. That's not very much integrated in many schools in Brazil. So I think we need to look into cognitive development and psychological theories, neuroscientific scientific theories of how the brain develops, so that we can use that to help us design what we want students to learn and how they need to learn at school. Otherwise, we're just wasting their time, because they're going to forget most of it. And you can ask any adult anywhere in the world how much of school they can actually remember. And so, in terms of content, right, we forget most of it. So why are we wasting time doing it, right? We need to rethink what we're teaching, how we are teaching, and how we are assessing our students.
Let me ask you a difficult question here, André. What?
Yes.
What?
A lot of difficult questions. Yes.
What are the best education theories, if there are any, according to you, that are being used currently?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too, because a lot of psychologists have proposed different theories, and so if you go back, a century ago, so the very first half of the 20th century, I think what was probably the most common theory was what we know as the behavioristic theory nowadays, which is basically, it's very much based on reinforcement. You do that, you get that. You don't do it, you're punished. So you can reinforce certain behaviors, and you can also discourage certain behaviors by adding punishment to the environment. So it's like, this is not a very good theory in many respects, and I will tell you why. Because it's not just about observable behavior. So that's the thing about behaviorism. Uh, I don't care about what's going on inside the brain. I care about what I can measure in terms of behavior, because that's what matters. B.F. Skinner is one of the guys who propagated the idea, and he used to say that, give me any child and I'll make him or her into anything I want, because I can condition the child through behaviorism. And we know that doesn't work exactly like that, but for many things it works. Repetition, drilling, and things like that, rewards. We know that that actually helps the brain learn. But we have humanism, for example, with Maslow. So Abraham Maslow talked about the pyramid of needs, the Maslow needs pyramid, right? So if you look at the base of the pyramid, and you're in Cairo, you're very familiar with pyramids. So we talk about pyramids since the ancient Egypts, and at the base of the pyramid, you should have the most urgent needs for you to survive, right? And then as you move along to the top of the pyramid, as one need is fulfilled, and then you get to the next one, you get to the one that he calls self-actualization. It's the desire to be better at things, right? And this is very true, because we need our physiological needs to be met. You cannot teach a starving kid. They cannot concentrate. They cannot learn anything. You cannot teach a kid who's scared, intimidated in the classroom, like I was saying. So that's humanism, right? But then we also have constructivism, or social constructivism. And I'm very fond of that theory, because it tells us that we can work together, that we require social interaction, and we can build things together, both as agents. So we are the agent of a structure, and also part of, so we are co-creators, let's say, of our reality. And one of my best, I'd say, inspiration here in Brazil, Paulo Freire. Is a big educator from Brazil, one of the most quoted educators in Brazil. And he talked a lot about social constructivism, critical pedagogy. It's not just accepting a prefabricated structure. It's also interfering with that and changing as you go, and creating your own reality through social interaction, right? But we also have Freud, for example. He talked about psychodynamics. So he mentioned that there's a struggle in your mind between your ego, your superego, your ego, and your id, right? So it's like the emotional part with the rational part, and then there's someone in the middle trying to juggle. You're like the little angel and the little devil on your shoulders, right? So, and we learn, we are basically emotional beings, and we are very much interested in fulfilling our immediate needs and things like that. So that makes us irrational sometimes. So there are many, many theories, but I think we can always look at some part of each of those theories and put together something entirely new. So I think behaviorism works for certain things. Cognitivism, like Piaget, for example, works. Constructivism as well. And you have other critical pedagogies that work. Waldorf, Reggio Emilia, they talk about constructing the world as you go. So it's very interesting to know about them, the basic principles, and see what works in your context, especially when you're doing something very specific. It depends very much on what you're doing, where you're doing, and what is the purpose, right?
So let's get back to the brain. Does the brain work differently for different people?
Yes, I'd say there are in many ways, the brain works very similarly to everyone, you know. Like right now, your brain is filled with neurotransmitters. There are very small brain chemicals sending messages all over. There's a lot of electrical activity. Because you're looking at the screen of your computer, I would see activation in your occipital lobe and things like, just like what's happening to my brain right now. But in terms of learning, I'd say that every human brain is as unique as a face. This is actually the first principle of the MBE science. Human brains are as unique as faces because the way our brain is wired uh, depends heavily on our genetic factors and also epigenetic from our ancestors and also our environment. So the kind of experiences we had. So everyone has had a very different experience in their lives. You know, even twins, if they are brought up together, they have basically, you know, the same genome, and but they have very different. Sometimes they have different personalities, and sometimes they are doing better in math than the other one. And you know, so because of the experiences, because of the perspectives they have in life, which means that we have some underlying principles of how the brain works, but we need to take into consideration two very important things. Differentiation. We need to make sure that all our students have not the potential, but the opportunity to work in their own way so that they can learn uh, in a more effective way. And we also have to work with personalization. We need to make it relevant to the student's reality. And everyone has a different reality, everyone has a different need. So I would say that, yes, brains are very different, but the basic stuff, like, you know, the physiology of your brain is very similar. Every brain is very similar in terms of, you know, how it looks anyway. But what is inside, how it's working inside, it's very different.
How to optimize the brain performance?
Yeah, I think there are many things we can do. I think the first thing is to, like I said, change our mindsets. First, to believe that we can do it. Because if you don't even believe you can do it, you're probably not going to do it. Carol Dweck wrote a book about the growth mindset, which is a great book. She has, you know, gone back and revised a couple of things, but the message is still the same. Having a fixed mindset, and this is not in absolute terms, you know, everybody has a fixed mindset for something, but having a fixed mindset means that you believe that you have a certain amount of talent or intelligence, and then you don't go further. You just stop there because that's all you think you can do, right? But if you have a growth mindset, you apply yourself more, you put more dedication, more effort, and you end up learning more long term, right? So change your mindset, use metacognitive skills or strategies. So what are metacognitive strategies? Is how the brain learns. So I know that I need to sleep to consolidate memory. So what's the point of you know, cramming the night before? I mean, maybe it works for performance on the test, but long-term learning, it doesn't work. You're going to forget everything in 2 days. You know, so you have to sleep well. You have to, you know, physiologically speaking, like Maslow says, take care of your body, eat well, be nurtured. You also have to use strategies that increase memory consolidation over time. So spaced repetition is a great one. For example, I need to learn X, whatever content. I need to revisit the same content for a certain time, increasing the distance between the last time I saw it and the next one. So maybe I learned something today, I should revise it tomorrow, and then 3 days after, and then 4 days after, and then a week after, and then at the end of the month. So I'm spacing, and that's great for memorization. I also understand that interleaving. So if I'm learning two subjects, it's better if I study subject A 30 minutes, subject B 30 minutes, go back to subject A, and so forth, instead of what we normally do. 3 hours studying subject A and then 3 hours studying subject B. It's actually better to interleave. You can also take short breaks. I call them brain breaks because you can, we work in two different modes. We have the focused mode and the diffuse mode. So if you stop and you stop paying attention or concentrating or focusing, you start your diffuse mode, and that helps consolidation. It's almost like you freed your storage in your working memory, and then you send the information back to the cortex and you start consolidating that. And now you're free to do whatever. And then you go back, so you retrieve. When you go back, that strengthens the neuronal network. So there are many things we can do to increase performance. And I think we just need to learn how the brain learns, you know? So learn about metacognition, use different strategies. There are many things we can do, really. It's not magical, but you will definitely get ahead, I think.
So let's ask this question. Can we train our brains?
Yes, we can train our brains. So much that people train our brains for us sometimes, like brainwashing. We've seen, you know, mass manipulation and things like that. What we need to do to train our brains is to make something a habit. So there's a great book by Charles Duhigg, Duhigg, I think, Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit. And he talks about a cycle that is a cue, a trigger that will normally trigger a behavior, and then you will get a reward. So it's cue, trigger, reward, basically. Or actually, cue, behavior, reward, right? So if you are like me and you love chocolate, for example, and you know you're not supposed to eat chocolate, but it has become a habit. I don't even think about it. It's automatic, right? So I feel the need, I want to have chocolate, and I normally do it in the afternoon after I have tea or coffee. So I have a sip of tea, and then my brain suddenly gives me the cue. I want some chocolate. And then I do have chocolate. That's the behavior. And then, you know, eating chocolate is a reward in itself. I feel good. I release dopamine in the brain, right? And then we do those things automatic. They are basically, we are on autopilot. We don't think about those things. And it's very hard to break this habit. We need to first consciously think about those things. So we can train our brains to be more cost effective by changing our habits. And there are many books with, you know, how many hours you need to create a new habit, like 10,000 hours or 28 days doing the same thing, you know. It's very hard to determine, but let's say you want to be more productive. You want to stop procrastinating. So one thing you can do, you can teach your brain the habit of using the Pomodoro technique. So there's a technique that you study for 25 minutes and you take a 5-minute break, and then 25 minutes, and then a 5-minute break, and you do 4 Pomodoros, like 25, 25, 25, with 5-minute breaks in between, and then you take a 30-minute break or an hour break or something like that. You can train your brain to do that without even thinking, because then it becomes a habit. And then you increase your productivity, for example. So the problem is you need a lot of grit, a lot of effort, you know, stay focused on task. After a while, you can do it. You don't even have to think about it. Yes.
Let's get quite philosophical. Do we control
Yes.
do we control the brain, or does the brain control us?
That's that's a $1 billion question. Well, basically, we are our brains, right? I think we control our brains in the sense that we can stop certain behaviors. We can self-regulate. We can do that. And there's also co-regulation. We can get help from other people to control our behaviors. Like our parents, they do that all the time. If you have a wife, a girlfriend, a partner, whatever, that can also happen. They can help you control your brain. But our brains, we are our brains. Everything we are, everything we know of ourselves is stored in our cortex as memory, right? Without our brains, we wouldn't be who we are. So that's, I think it's not us controlling the brain, it's the brain controlling itself, because we are our brains. So our brain has the capacity to stop certain things from happening. Sometimes when we are at this heightened emotional state, let's say you're very angry because something happened, or very emotional, crying, or ecstatic, super happy, or something like that, you are going to make poor decisions because you're not thinking straight, right? You're not really, but you can bring yourself, with concentration, awareness, you can bring yourself back to earth and say, okay, I need to focus, I need to clear my head and think about this, because sometimes, we get carried away with our emotions, right? And then we make poor decisions. So the brain can control itself. We can. It takes time. It takes, especially kids cannot do it very well because they're still developing their brains. But we can do it. Sometimes it's not always effective. Sometimes we get carried away. We end up doing stupid things. But I think we can teach our brains to control us and to control themselves, because we are our brains, right?
Are the brains, or are our brains lazy?
Yes, that's that's actually one of the principles I use when I am teaching a workshop. Our brains are very lazy in a sense, because our brains, they're not even 2% of our body mass in terms of weight. If you think about it, they weigh like 1.4 kilos or something like that. And they consume up to 25% of all our energy or calorie intake every day. So they are very, costly to maintain, right? We need a lot of energy just for our brains. 1/4 of everything we eat every day goes to the brain, which means our brains need to make smart decisions. And if you think about, ancient times or prehistoric historical times, when we were fighting for survival, it was not very smart for you to do anything that would require your brain to spend a lot of energy, because it was very hard to get by food, right? Nowadays, we don't have that problem. I mean, people who are privileged, right? Because a lot of other people in the world, billions of people are living under horrible, horrible conditions. So our brain is going to program itself in a way that it's going to save as much energy as it can, because we don't know when we're going to get food again. It's nowadays, of course, modern people who have access to things, who don't have to worry about those things, we don't really think about it. It's very unconscious, right? But imagine yourself starving or living under horrible conditions, in poverty. You need to try to save as much energy as possible. But then it's an evolutionary trait of our brain, so we cannot really get rid of that. So you see that if you need to change any of your habits, it takes so much effort, because the process of making things automatic in your brain is effortful, but once it's done, it's there. So for you to rewire that, to break that cycle, and then go back, it takes so much energy that the brain doesn't want to do it. So that's why it's so hard for people to stop doing things like smoking or eating chocolate, or procrastinating or things like that. It's very hard because the brain is just trying to save energy, as it doesn't know when it's going to get food again. And yes, we have very lazy brains. Yeah.
Do our brains deceive us?
Yes. I'll be very straight to the point in this one. We know from psychological research that we can have false memories in our cortex. So if you go to even eyewitnesses, for example, when they are testifying in court, they may have actually not seen what they are testifying. They may have created that in their imaginations, because our memories are very organic. So there are networks in the brain, and they are very easily affected by emotions, right? So if I feel a little different, or if I like the person I'm testifying against, I may change certain facts in the brain without even realizing. So the brain will deceive you all the time. The brain will tell you, don't do that. That's going to consume a lot of energy, even though it's good for you. So let's stay home. And yeah, we have to try to be careful with that, because the brain is fooling around all the time.
Yeah. Let's go to another area. What is mental priming or syntactic persistence?
Yes, this is an interesting question, because priming has to do with getting a stimulus from the environment and then giving a certain response connected to that stimulus without even thinking. It's a very automatic process. So I ask a lot of people, if I think of the word, if I tell you the word blue, what comes to your mind? And then I ask people to write down a couple of words. A lot of those people will write sky, for example, or color, or because those words are connected, right? So it primes another word. They're connected in a way that, in a network, that we don't have to think to get the other words attached to this word, right? So when you think about syntactic priming or structural priming, it's very funny, because if you read something, if you read a sentence that was written in a specific way, or if somebody told you something, or even if you said something that is in a specific way, the next sentence you form or you construct will very much, very probably have a very similar structure, because you primed yourself to. So let's say somebody used a passive structure. Let's say that George was given the toy or something like that, or the toy was given to George. So that's a passive structure. If I read that, the next sentence that I construct might be in the passive voice, because I was primed by that sentence, right? And it's something that I'm not even aware of. It's something that is just, how the brain works. And this is, some people say that it's a great way for you to teach chunks and structures in English, for example. You just say them to your students, and then you are going to prompt them in a way that they are probably going to use the structure the next time they say something. And others don't agree with that, because there are different types of theories under that. But from a lot of research, we know that priming is definitely something that exists in many different arenas of human knowledge. So I can, maybe, if I want people to vote for a certain candidate, I can show them images or words that relate to something that refers to that candidate. And maybe when they're going to vote, they are going to think of that candidate in a very subconscious way, which is very weird, because that means that we can manipulate people with the things we show them by priming a response, right?
So my question here is how to break this priming.
Yes, I think it requires focusing and questioning, but sometimes, priming is usually associated with a very quick response to something, and you don't really have time to do those things, right? So when we are conducting a priming experiment in psychology, what we do is we show a picture on a computer, or an image, or a text, or a word, or whatever, and then you have to hit a button, for example, press a button, right? You don't have time to think. So priming under those circumstances, I don't think you can break very easily, because they are wired in your brain in a way that, you don't even think, you just go for it. But if you do have time to think, you need to stop and ask yourself questions. We call it the Socratic method, right? And I think Socrates was known for doing that. So rumor has it, Socrates was very annoying, because he kept asking very important people in high places very complicated questions, like going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think that breaks priming, because we have stereotypes in our minds that's how we were brought up, They are part of who we are. But if we start asking questions and testing ourselves, we can break that. But it's not an easy process, I'd say. I think it's very hard for you to break this stereotype. And priming, again, is more related to a very quick response. You don't even have time to think. So there are terrible studies showing how we normally assign violence or violent behavior to people who have a different skin color because of everything we see on TV and how we are brought up. So if you show a picture of a white man holding a gun and a black man holding a gun, and you do that many times and you ask the participant to click on something, they are mostly going to attach or match the black man with the gun with more violent behavior than the white man with the gun because of the wiring in our brains. We have seen in movies, people have been telling us that that's how the world works, and then we have those stereotypes. So if it's very fast, you don't even think, you just answer. But then if you have time to think, ask yourself, why do I think like that? Is it something that comes from within, or is it part of a structure that is bigger and is telling me to think that way?
What else would you like to add?
Well, I would like to add, for those of you who are interested in knowing more about the MBE science, mind, brain, education, I am trying to be very active on social media and my website. I have a lot of blog posts that you can read about spaced repetition, active retrieval, brain breaks, and emotional intelligence and things like that. So just access edcrocks.com. So edcrocks.com, and follow me on social media with the same handle, edcrocks. You'll find me on social media, and start learning more about the brain. It's going to help you become a better teacher, a better person, a better learner.
I can't thank you enough, André, for all of this fantastic information.
My pleasure, Nour. It was a pleasure, an honor, and I hope it's useful to everyone who's watching, okay?
Thank you, really, indeed.